Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Night Drive, Week 10, first round playoff, whatever you want to call it, podcast. I'm Josh Welge here with Steve Soucie. Michael DeWojcik will be along with us shortly. Steve, have you got any sleep since Friday and Saturday? And, just kind of what's your thoughts as we start to digest the brackets and get ready for football?
Yeah, it seems like there's just kind of a chaotic period until the pairings get announced, and then I get maybe a couple hours to kind of soak it in, and then it's right into, well, now that we have the brackets, let's start to study them over comprehensively. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of days and feeling like I have a pretty good handle on at least what the brackets look like. What's going to happen? I think that's anybody's guess.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's now we got teams in front of us and brackets and whatnot, and now it's just a matter of saying, oh, what's this matchup that we like, and wow, when do these two teams play, and just a lot of stuff to get after it, but a lot of excitement too. This is definitely the best time of the year as we get ready for the playoffs. And like I said, I want to maybe bring in Michael DeWojcik to talk about some of these teams and kind of talk about the Catholic League teams that he covers for us. Michael, how you doing?
Good. How's it going, guys?
Doing good. Before we dive into it, I just want to do a kind of brief thing. You were at the Loyola Mt Carmel game, last Friday, and a really good win for the Loyola. I don't know. Do they reassert themselves as a team to watch? Going into the playoffs, that was a pretty impressive win going into the playoffs for them.
Yeah, I think Loyola showed you that, if they're fully healthy, there's a reason why they won back-to-back state championships, right? And obviously, by any means, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy for them to just go get a three-peat or anything like that. But I think that this team is showing that, Ryan Fitzgerald looks comfortable now. It seems like he's been able to get that hamstring issue pretty much, it's not perfect, obviously, at this point of the season. No one's perfect at this time, but he seems fairly comfortable. You see, Donovan Robinson, he's healthy. Drew McPherson, their running back, is really asserting himself right now. He's a real threat running the ball and catching the ball as well. So Loyola has a lot of offensive targets, and their defense has figured some things out now. After losing Connor Sullivan to a torn ACL on the second play of the season against East St. Louis, it took some shuffling and that kind of stuff. But they figured it out, and that defense is rolling, and you saw them take away one of the best offenses and one of the best quarterbacks in Illinois on Friday.
We're going to, for the most part, break down the first round matchups that were really catching our eye. But the one thing about 8A is that, Lincoln Way East and Loyola have been the two teams that you're like, all right, where are they on the 8A bracket? And when are they going to make reservations to play each other in championship game? Well, that's not going to happen this year. They're both on one side of the bracket. Just kind of both for both you guys, what's your thoughts on 8A? It seems like there's been sort of the notion throughout the year that maybe it's a little bit more wide open. I'm not sure about that. When Lincoln Way East has Jonas Williams in their team and Loyola is coming off of that win over Mt Carmel, what's your guys' overall take on 8A?
Well, I think the bracket in general was kind of interesting. Like you said, it was you're trying to figure out if they were going to be on the same side of the bracket. So the obvious rematch championship game that we've had the last 2 years wouldn't materialize into a third. These two programs have a long history with one another, so it's not unrealistic to kind of look at that as the bellwether as to where 8A is going to go. But this bracket makes it really interesting to kind of contemplate who will be the other team out of there. I think you think in your mind's eye, the top is probably going to end up being a semifinal game between Lincoln Way East and Loyola. I'm sure Marist might have something to say about that too. But, when you look at the bottom half, then you're like, well, then who's the other team? Because it's got to be something else, because your default mechanism is that it's going to be Loyola and Lincoln Way East, because that's just kind of the way that it's been. Is it Lions? I mean, they've had a really good season. Can Oswego's defense carry them, that far? Naperville Central, are they going to be able to bounce back from that loss to Lincoln Way East and try to get another crack at them? Palatine, I mean, it's a pretty substantial list of teams that I think can make the run through the South bracket. And I think that's going to make a real interesting watch, while you're also monitoring the north side to see if Loyola Lincoln Way East does actually play out in the semifinals.
a couple interesting matchups that stood out to me when I was looking at 8A bracket. First on the top half of the bracket was Maine South playing at Neighborville North. I mean, that's the game where Maine South, they're a team that's not afraid to score points over the years. I'm not quite sure who's playing quarterback for them right now. They've had a couple of different guys that play quarterback. I know who's playing quarterback for Neighborville North. It's Jacob Bell. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the state. What do you make of that game, Souce?
It's a very interesting one. It's one that when it popped up on the bracket as far as 8A went, that was one of, I don't think there's a lot of first round matchups that I really oohed and awed at, but that one popped off the page. Like you said, Maine South's played a lot better football in the second half. They kind of started slow and kind of fell off everyone's radar. That may be a mistake. And Naperville North, it seems like every week, Jacob Bell and the offense was putting up these giant numbers. I mean, obviously the 9-touchdown performance against Homewood Flossmoor stands out for him, but this is a first-round matchup that we talked about it before. We thought we might have some of these first-round matches where you look at them and go, man, that's a rough first-round matchup for both sides. Definitely think that's the case there.
On the bottom half of the bracket, we talked about, all right, who's going to come out of there. And I don't know if this team's going to, but a team that's interesting to me, just because what they were able to do week 8 against East St. Louis, it's Edwardsville, taking them the way they did, losing 14-7. They make that long drive north on Friday to York for a 6 o'clock start. So they must be leaving around lunchtime in Edwardsville. But really interesting matchup. I mean, Edwardsville, from what I hear from guys down there, is they have, one of the best defenses in the state. They have the Epineza kid, who's the number 1 player in the senior class, defensive lineman. And then York has Joe Reif, who's going to Notre Dame. Souce, what do you make about that? Because I mean, again, the bottom half of the bracket, I'm not sure, but Edwardsville is a bit of a wild card. I think
I've witnessed, a lot of people talk about, that they've got to make that long travel. That's probably going to have an effect on them. But I've witnessed Edwardsville do this multiple times. Jump off that bus, look fresh as a daisy, and before you know it, they're up 14-0. I've seen them do this multiple times. So it's not like a fluke. It's not something that just happened once. I've physically witnessed it a couple of times. So I know that that's something that they're prepared to do this time of year. They play a schedule that gets them ready for these types of games. Their 3 losses this year to East St. Louis, Lawrence Central in Indiana, and Desmet out of St. Louis. And if you don't know the history of those schools, both of those out-of-state schools are really strong programs. So they come up here, unlike a lot of teams that come up to Chicagoland after playing a different schedule. Both they and East St. Louis don't mess around in scheduling. So maybe their conference doesn't give them a lot of challenges, but they seek them outside of conference. So they're ready for these types of games. And that's another one. When I look at it on paper, that could be a very interesting first-round game.
Yeah, and I can tell you right now that Oswego, if they were to win Friday, well, I don't know if they're hoping that Edwardsville wins, because then they get to have the long drive next week at Edwardsville. So we'll see what happens with that. I want to kind of keep things moving along because we got 8 classes to talk about. Drop down to 7A. And Michael, I know the game that as soon as we saw the brackets that stood out to us, Fenwick Brother Rice just jumped off the page. I mean, that's a really good first round matchup between CCL ESCC teams.
Yeah, it's definitely a matchup that probably shouldn't be a first round matchup, right? Like these are really good teams with really elite defenses and offenses that are trying, have figured things out here in late second half. So obviously I've always had my quirks with the way that the IHSA does its playoffs, but it is what it is. You got Fenwick going against Brother Rice too. You've got a lot of Division I talent on that field. You've obviously got Christian Pierce. He's being recruited by a lot of major programs. For Brother Rice, you got Braden Parks, King Liggins, who on some underclassmen in the junior for Brother Rice, defensive tackles who are being recruited. And obviously for Fenwick, you got Matt Marshall, Auburn recruit. You got Jack Paris, who's obviously a Division I recruit, and Tommy Thies, who's getting interest from a lot of college programs. So you've got a lot of talent on that field playing in a first-round game, and it'll be really interesting to see. At this point, this matchup kind of feels like a point where it's just like who's going to make offensively, I suppose, like the less amount of mistakes, right? Because of how good these defenses are. And who's going to be maybe able to take advantage of like a momentary lapse, whether it's broken coverage, whether it's a missed tackle or something like that. Because it feels like this is where that game is going to come down to.
Obviously we're focusing on first round matchups, but you got to see Mount Carmel last Friday. You've seen it a couple times, and they're in the bottom half of the bracket here, and they're actually going to be starting on the road playing at Harlem. What's your take on Mount Carmel as we go in the playoffs?
Talking with Coach Jordan Lynch after the game, after they lost to Loyola, and he was asked, what does this do for your playoff, seeding or playoff, heading into the playoffs. And he was like, I think this loss actually kind of helps us, which is funny with the way that the system's made. I don't know really, obviously at the time he didn't know what the path was going to be, but Mount Carmel doesn't have a necessarily easy path. I mean, they're a 19 seed. They're probably the best 19 seed you've seen. But they've got Harlem in the first round. Potentially they play St. Charles North in the second round. And then you got Normal or Prospect if things kind of go chalk out there in the quarterfinals. So by any means, it's not an easy route for Mount Carmel, but, there are a lot of good talented teams. But, as a 19 seed, this is an electric offense that maybe, they kind of figure things out after a down game against Loyola. Defensively, they're pretty stout. So I expect them to be able to go to the road and then have a likely home game against St. Charles North in the second round. But, this team is talented. Obviously, they've got a lot of, opportunities to strike early here.
7A bracket, Soucie, is interesting because in the grouping them into little quadrants. I mean, you got the one quadrant that's got Downers Grove North and Batavia that's both in there. Then you got the one with Mount Carmel. Then there's one with a very good unbeaten Quincy team that people probably don't know too much about, but they should. And then you got the top half of the bracket, where you got a couple public leagues at the top, and you have a lot of teams that I think they're good, but they're not like strike fear into my heart type things. What do you make of that top sort of grouping of 8, and then specifically that Bradley Jacobs game is interesting.
That quad is kind of a hodgepodge of teams that either
good word for it. Yeah.
I don't know if they're good. They might be. They've got, they might be 8-1, but their resume is kind of questionable on their schedule. So I'm not sure. They might be really good, but I don't know. And then, you look at that top part, Young and Kenwood, it's the 132 game, but they played during the regular season, and Young, despite being undefeated, won that game by 1 point. So that game could flip easily and go the other way. I mean, I think there's a realistic opportunity here where all 4 of the lower seeds could win in the first round. So, I mean, it's a possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but when I look at those games, I think I kind of lean towards the underseed in almost all of them, but I don't have a heavy lean, if that makes any sense. I feel like a lot of them are close to toss-ups in this situation, which is a strange thing to kind of take when the gaps in the seeds are that wide. As for the Jacobs-Bradley game, that's another game where you kind of look at it and go, I'm not sure what to make of it because, Jacobs isolated to the Fox Valley. So is the Fox Valley down this year? Is it up? I don't know. Bradley's schedule was pretty good in some ways and not real good in others. I mean, they didn't qualify a lot of playoff points, but they played competitively with some really good teams, beat a couple of good teams, and got knocked around pretty good by a couple of good teams. So they're kind of that's a suitable 16-17 game for me because they're teams that I think are good, but they're also teams that have some question marks around them too.
Yeah, that 7A bracket is just kind of unusual. Yes. Because I mean, I'm not trying to take away from certain programs, but it goes back to, you might, if you can get past the second round or the quarterfinal, then you might be in Bloomington. I'm not trying to take away from teams, but I look at, programs like a Downers North, Batavia, or certainly Mount Carmel. I mean, the hardest roads could be, second or third round, not the semifinals. Again, not to take any of the programs, and I could be completely wrong. I've been wrong before. So, we'll see what happens with that.
That bracket has a lot of, I think later in the game, it has a lot of potential with like the quarterfinal matchups. I think if it goes a certain way, you could look at that bracket and go, boy, that is a doozy of a quarterfinal schedule. And it could go the other way. You could look at it and go, what happened here? So, I mean, it could take a lot of different roads.
Yeah, the other program that's just kind of hanging out there in the third quadrant is there, and Michael, St. Rita. They're a team that, man, obviously they've tested themselves. What do you make about them as we go into the playoffs? I believe that, they got a first round game with Guilford, and then they potentially could get Hononegin in the second round.
Yeah, I think they're a team that took a big step after, they made the playoffs in Martin Hopkins' first year, lost their first round game, went on to win the Prep Bowl, which I know a lot of people might look their nose down upon and that kind of stuff. But playing in the Prep Bowl does give you more practices, and that does kind of help build your program. And I think you saw that a lot with, St. Rita, where a lot of their guys who are returning, came back and they seem motivated. Nick Herman is the lead running back for them. Armbruster has come in as a quarterback and has shown that, although, St. Rita likes to run the ball, they can throw the ball too, and they've got offensive targets. And that defense is really, really stout, really able to take away some opportunities. I saw them against Nazareth earlier in the season, and, they hung around for the first half, and then, Naz kind of turned it on in the second half, and there was some questionable offensive play calling by Rita in the second half, where they kind of got away from what was working for them in the first half. But, Rita has a 10 seed at 7-2. I think that they can, make some noise here. And I think that there's a good opportunity for them to kind of show, I think a lot of people go into the matchup thinking, all right, they're going to run the ball a lot, and, we're going to pack the box a lot, and that's how we're going to defend them. But I do think that they have targets where they can throw the ball as well. So it'll be interesting to see, especially as the weather kind of gets a little bit colder here, or maybe it doesn't. It's hard to tell at this point. But it'll be interesting to see how much that changes their game plan offensively once we get into cooler temperatures.
Want to move along to 6A and Soucie. Number one, tell me why we won't have an East St. Louis Cary Grove final, or is there a chance of that? And then, the other thing, first round matchup wise, that Glenwood Crete-Monee game is interesting. Glenwood's got a couple really nice wins to their credit. Crete-Monee was rolling along until they hit Kankakee. What do you make about those two things?
I think it's hard for me to not logically jump to the possibility of that. But there are a couple of obstacles here that I think you need to address. I mean, in the 6A bracket for Cary Grove, I think there are some intriguing teams that they're going to have to deal with at some point if they get to there. Libertyville is a team that has had an excellent season, and I think you can't discount them. Geneva, even though they lost that Week 9 game to St. Charles North, they're a great fit in this bracket. So you look at that situation, and I think those teams are going to – one of those two teams, I think, could potentially give – Cary Grove a really, really interesting semifinal game. And on the south side of the bracket, it looks like it's a pretty clean road for East St. Louis. And I know they got them last year in the quarterfinals, but I'm just going to give one little point out fact to Kankakee right now. They lost their opening game to Nazareth. They gave up 37 points. They've given up 40 points over the course of the rest of the season. So that's defining on how good that Kankakee defense can be when it's playing the way it can. It's a very athletic team. If East St. Louis overlooks Kankakee based on their past history, they could be in some trouble there, because I think that's a really good Kankakee team. Got a promising sophomore quarterback in Philip Turner. That's a team right now that I think is playing about as well as anybody in any classification. So if East St. Louis comes in and doesn't give their best effort, Kankakee could give them some trouble.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Kankakee's just been on a roll since that Nazareth game, and definitely a team to watch going to the playoffs. I want to drop down quickly to 5A. And Michael, a couple teams that I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on. Nazareth and St. Francis. They played a heck of a game. I almost said the other word. A heck of a game last Friday. And they're set up to potentially meet again in the quarterfinals. Nazareth obviously goes in with a much different situation than last year. Finishing 7-2. St. Francis got that big win against Nazareth last Friday. What do you make about those two teams going to the playoffs? St. Francis opens at home against Sterling. Nazareth has Peyton.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. St. Francis, I got a chance to talk with Bob McMillan ahead of their Week 9 game, and he's like, we're getting there. We're taking the first couple steps. We've got a young team. We're getting there. I think we're starting to get to the process where we want to be. And obviously beating Naz is a big win for them. And I think you're starting to see everything click, right? Like that offense, you've seen glimpses of it through much of the season. Obviously they used a strong passing attack by Brady Palmer in order to beat Loyola in Week 3. So you've seen this offense do it. Now the question is, can they consistently do this, right? Like, they have shown glimpses, and then there are some games where they just kind of get in their own way and, either defensively let big plays happen or offensively just maybe misfire and not, complete as many third downs as they want to. But both St. Francis and Naz are really interesting. Obviously, they get a chance to meet in the semifinals against each other. That'd be a lot of fun. I like Bennett in that area too. Looking to be in their first playoffs since 2019 after being 4-5 the last 3 years. It should be really interesting because I can see, in the upper half of the bracket, I can see the CCL, ESCC teams doing very well, or, one bad game could really sink them just based on how hot and cold things can be sometimes. But when it comes to their first round matchup, I think, St. Francis, Bennett, and Naz in the top half of the bracket, I think that they should be able to move to the second round.
The other team and Soucie, I'm not sure if the public league is going to be able to do any damage in the playoffs, but I think if there's going to be the team that does it, it's probably going to be Morgan Park. What do you make about them? They open up against Tinley Park, and then they could get a Metamora Centralia next. Potentially, there's a path for them to make a run, and they're probably the public league's best hope.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I really like what Morgan Park is about. Generally, I saw them last year lose in the quarterfinals to St. Francis in a game where St. Francis eventually kind of wore them down. But you could see the obvious talent on this football team. This is another team where I'm going to throw out like a weird defensive number on you. Morgan Park lost to Marist in the opening week of the season. They gave up 29 points in that game, and obviously Marist is a really good 8A team. But since that Marist loss, Morgan Park's given up 13 points. So, and they're not exactly, sure, some of the public league teams that they're playing aren't quite up to the snuff of them, but Simeon's a good team, and they routed them in week 9. This team looks like it's really, really strong. I think as far as the South bracket goes, I think Morgan Park can do some real damage in here, and when I look at the bottom half of that bracket, I think Joliet Catholic is probably your favorite, even though they're coming out of the 6th hole. I think we've seen over the past few years, Joliet Catholic has had a tendency to get into this 5A South bracket, and then you see the clear differences between some of the other Southern to Central Illinois conferences and what it takes to match up with the CCL team in this situation, because teams haven't really been able to do it. Both Joliet Catholic and Providence have had successful runs running through that South bracket, and in a lot of cases, kind of dominating those teams in the South bracket. So until proven otherwise, I think Joliet Catholic is probably a team to look out for as well on that side.
Dropping down to 4A again, one of the matchups that jumped off the page when I saw it when it came out was St. Lawrence playing RichmondBurton. St. Lawrence, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was the last undefeated team in a public league, or not public league, Child Catholic League, and they obviously made a great run last year in the playoffs. But they've had a couple, hits the last couple of weeks, and their quarterback's been down. On the other side, RichmondBurton, they had that loss against Johnsburg early in the year, and I was kind of like, all right, maybe this isn't quite what they were. Well, they've been on an absolute roll ever since then. What do you make about that matchup?
Yeah, I think the biggest question here is St. Lawrence quarterback Chris Katkowski going to play, right? Like, obviously, I know, St. Lawrence is a running team. They majority 75% of the time like to run the ball. But Chris is going to Illinois State, and he's got an arm, and he's been able to show it, and that's kind of, created that kind of play where, you can't just stack the box and just defend them, where, he'll be able to get you on a big completion and take advantage of some one-on-one opportunities. So that'll be a big factor in this game. Those are kind of the games that St. Lawrence has lost here. They lost to Brother Rice, and they lost here in week 9 too. So that'll be a major question, just to see whether, does he play? Because if he doesn't play, I think that kind of tells you that St. Lawrence is just going to run the ball a lot, and that kind of makes it much easier for RichmondBurton to defend as opposed to having that pass threat.
The other team and the other matchup that I was looking at, Soucie, is Morango playing at Dixon. And Dixon, if people didn't see it, they came about 15 seconds away from beating Byron. I believe it was last Friday, right? It seems like it's been 2 years. Maybe it was week 8.
It was week 8, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, they came very close to beating Byron, which is honestly, if you want to put impressive win or impressive loss, then that would be it. They play Morango, who's got a really good quarterback, David Lopez. They got a big win over Sandwich to get in the playoffs. I guess number one is, what do you make about that matchup? And Dixon, I think there's a path for them in a run. If they can play Byron the way they did, I think they're a team to watch in 4A.
Yeah, I agree. Morango's just kind of tricky. They've been tricky all season long. Needed to get that win over Sandwich just to get into the playoffs, and did it in a somewhat convincing fashion. So they were able to fight their way in, but they've just kind of been up and down. So it's kind of like, what version are they going to get? But Dixon's been really, really steady, doing a really, really nice job, and have, picked up some wins along the way that, in a fashion that make you go, okay, maybe they're ready to make kind of a deep run. I think it's a good draw for them. A team that I'm kind of intrigued with on the south side of that bracket is a 7-2 Coal City team. Their losses are to Morris in the first week of the season and to, longtime rival Wilmington. But if you excise those two results and look at their stats, they're incredible. I mean, the level of dominance that they've put on in the other 7 games this season, I think Coal City is definitely a team that will provide an obstacle, whether it be an interesting game potentially with Rockford Boylan in the second round or maybe Dixon in the quarters. I think Coal City is definitely a team to keep an eye on.
Yeah, as we get into 3A, and I know we're looking at the first round, but I'm already looking towards the potential second round game. Montini playing Byron. That game would be at Montini, I believe, the way things work out. Michael, what do you make about where Montini is at going into playoffs? It seems like, I believe they went to the sophomore quarterback, and their offense, it seems, to just taken off ever since then. They've had a great defense all year, but they seem to be in a really good place going into playoffs. They're obviously going to need to be in a good place if they're going to be able to topple Byron.
Yeah, they went over to Abrams as their quarterback, and that has just transformed them offensively. I think I forget what the exact number is. It's roughly around like 27 points a game ever since he took over. They've looked dominant ever since. And then defensively, they brought back 11 of their 12 returners. So they've got that experience defensively. So I think that makes Montini a really interesting team in 3A. I say this a lot with the 3A and 4A teams where, for DePaul Prep also in 4A, where you're kind of like, well, how good are these teams? Like, obviously they lost by, X amount of points to Loyola or like Marist or Mount Carmel. But at the same time, you got to realize that those are 8A schools and you're playing against, like schools in 3A and 4A. So like Soucie was talking about with the South bracket, I think that CCL-ESC schedule is a lot. It's a grinder. It gets you through. So I'm really interested to see, I think Montini should win their first round matchup. And then I'm curious to see how they do against Byron. Obviously, Byron able to get ahead of Montini last season to win that state championship after beating them in the semifinals. So it's really interesting to see how that matchup lines up, in week 2, and how much Montini kind of learned from that and whether they're going to employ something differently just based on how Byron really likes to, run their fast-paced offense.
And a lot of their guys are back from both teams from last year. I mean, Byron was really young last year. Montini's got a ton of talent, a ton of players back. So, I mean, it's not like they're entirely new teams. So, yeah, definitely got that one on our radar. Soucie, any other 3A matchups kind of stand out to you? I know Tolana-Roxana was kind of interesting to me. Roxana got semis. Tolana's got a ton of tradition. And then Mount Carmel playing Sullivan. Sullivan's 9-0 quietly, but Mount Carmel, they got some tradition there as well.
Yeah, and I think overall I kind of look at this bracket and I can't help peeking ahead. Like you peek ahead to round 2, which is understandable there, but I peek ahead even further when I start thinking about, okay, after who wins that game, the thing that you kind of have to keep an eye on in that North bracket is the 2A state champions from last year are in this 3A bracket, and that's Wilmington. And, my mind goes to whoever survives that potential Byron Montini game in the second round will probably 2 weeks later have to deal with Wilmington. So that's really intriguing for me as well to see how Wilmington, they've been in 3A for years. They've been to state championship games in 3A before. It's not that I don't think they can compete there, because I definitely think they will. It's just going to be interesting to see how they match up. And Byron and Wilmington kind of have a long track record of running into each other in the postseason with a mixed bag of results. I once saw Byron snatch a playoff win away from Wilmington in the last minute of a game down there that left that whole community stunned. So it's there are a lot of interesting stories playing out in that North bracket, I think, that over the course of the next 5 weeks.
You mentioned Wilmington moving up to 3A, which creates an interesting situation in 2A. Wilmington, the defending state champion, is not there. I believe that state runner-up Athens did not make the playoffs this year. I guess two-part. What do you make of the 2A bracket? And one of the matchups that kind of stood out to me, because, with the kind of smaller schools, I always look at that Northwest Upstate Illini Conference. A lot of good football there. Eastland Pearl City, they took third in that league. And then Rockridge, a really good team. I think they just beat Monmouth. What do you make of 2A?
2A is going to be interesting because it's going to provide an opportunity for at least a couple of teams in this situation, because, the North bracket has been dominated by teams that are not in this field in the past in terms of who gets there. You've had Wilmington coming through the North bracket in recent years. A little farther back, Sterling Newman, who is now in 1A, was kind of the team that would kind of typically emerge from the top of that bracket. So somebody's going to Hancock Stadium that probably hasn't been there in a while, whoever that ends up being out of the north side of the bracket. I think some of the interesting teams you just mentioned there, even though it's an 8-9 game, I think those two teams, Rockridge, Eastland Pearl City, are interesting. Farmington's had one heck of a year. And then you get a little bit farther down in there, Tri-Valley seems to always be a team that is kind of in the mix for going deep. So it's a pretty interesting North bracket just to see who's going to, get unearthed there. But when you switch over to the South, there's one team that kind of stands out to me, and it's because of a situation in regards to what kind of schedule they played up in. Quincy Notre Dame is in the 2A field this year. Last year, they got into the field as a 16 seed, toppled the 1, kept going for a little while. This year, they've played fantastically. And the thing that's most interesting to me about Quincy Notre Dame is when I heard they were joining the Central State 8, I was like, boy, that might be biting off a little bit more than they can chew. They're legitimately a 300, 400 enrollment school. And then they're playing all year long. They're playing 4A, 5A, 6A schools in that conference, and some pretty good ones too. It's not just a run-of-the-mill 4, 5, 6A conference. That's a strong conference. So what did Quincy Notre Dame do? They went to that conference. They won all their games in league play. Their only loss of the season was in week 1 to Quincy, who went 9-0 and is considered to be a potential team that could win 7A. So Quincy Notre Dame, I think, is the team to really keep an eye on in 2A.
Dropping down to 1A, I want to finish up. You talked about looking ahead, and the matchup that I'm potentially looking at is if we can get to the state finals. Lena Winslow has been, one of the teams to beat, the team to always watch in 1A. But man, that Belleville Audubon team is pretty impressive. What do you make about that? And then also the one of the matchups that I like is Hope Academy, who is 5-4, but man, they play anybody that comes their way. They're going to Sterling Newman. That's a really good first round game. At least it's an interesting first round game.
Yeah, I really like Althoff a lot. I watched practically the whole game with Caneland on Saturday, and the thing that overwhelmed me, even though De'Air Hill, the Oregon-bound junior running back, wasn't playing in that game, I couldn't believe it was a 1A team. It did not look anything like a 1A team. They're going to be a very difficult out. I know Camp Point Central managed to do it last year. They built a giant lead and then hung on. Someone's going to have to do that to them again, because that looks like an incredibly talented team on video. As far as that 1A matchup that you mentioned, it is an intriguing game between Sterling Newman and Hope Academy. Hope Academy's 4 losses, a pretty good group of teams. Wheaton Academy, Chicago Christians had a very good year. Simeon and Wilmington. So Hope Academy is not your typical 5-4 1A team. That's for sure. So I think that makes for a really interesting first round matchup as well. But, aside from, like we mentioned, Althoff, there's still a lot of good football teams in here, especially at the 1A level. Lena cannot be ignored. They're not going to go away quietly. You've got, other teams in there too that I think are potentially really dangerous. I think we're going to have a lot of interesting second round games in the 1A playoffs, because you still got Camp Point Central that's very good. Hardin Calhoun kind of emerged as a pretty solid team this year. You look at, and Leroy. I don't want to forget Leroy in this situation too. A tremendously good defensive team. So there's just a lot of teams in 1A that I think you're going to get some interesting games in that tournament and could have it go a lot of different ways.
A lot of good stuff. A lot of good stuff. Friday Night Drive. Souce's first round predictions for 1A through 8A popping up on Friday Night Drive. Michael's got his CCL ESCC notebook. Be covering a ton of football this weekend. A lot of excitement for Steve Soucie and Michael DeWojak. I'm Josh Welge. Thanks for joining us.